Okay, so communities. What we'll talk about a little bit, not all of this, but we'll talk about what communities are, what is it that constitutes a community, and then Varun and Divya are going to come in later today and talk about how to quantify communities and compare communities. So there are communities, ecological communities out there in nature. We need to understand those, and to understand them, we need to quantify them. We need to be able to measure communities, and that's what Varun and Divya will be talking about later today. We'll talk a little bit about what is it that actually uh, leads to community structure. What are the processes that end up creating an ecological community? And those processes can either be non-random, they can be things like competition, they can be things like predation, they can be things that are deterministic, or they can be things that are random. So they can be stochastic processes also that end up structuring communities. So um, so what is a community? A community is a group of either actually, this is the broadest definition of a community. Okay, community ecology is full of various definitions given by various people, and it can get very confusing, but this is the broadest definition of a community. It's a group of actually or potentially interacting organisms that are also interacting with the environment. So uh, so as a broad definition, basically what you've got is a bunch of species that are there in a particular location at a particular time. Either they're actually interacting with each other, one is eating the other, one is competing with another species, or they can potentially interact. And we'll talk about what those interactions look like. We'll talk about what those interactions are, various kinds of interspecies interactions. So a community is bound by space and time, right? So communities can change over space or they can change over time. So the same set of species today might not be there 1 year from now. So the community can change in this same location over time, or the communities change over space. So if I move from a desert to a rainforest, the communities are going to change. Right? So actually interacting or potentially interacting species. And these interactions then lead to patterns that emerge from the process of interaction. And we'll see what some of those patterns are. And communities can be very simple. So if you go to, um, high altitude grassland, you'll see communities that are made up of maybe 3 or 4 species of plants, right? And they're all interacting with each other, interacting in terms of competition and so on. Uh, but you can also have communities that are extremely complex. You can have communities like coral reefs, for example, that have hundreds of species of corals, hundreds of species of fish, hundreds of other, thousands of other species of invertebrates and so on. And all of those are interacting with each other. Right? So you've got a very complex community at one end over here, whereas you might have a relatively simple community in places like high altitude alpine grasslands or deserts. Now, community ecology, which is a a very ambitious sort of undertaking in science, is the study of ecological communities. So it's the study of community patterns. What are the mechanistic processes? What are the processes that make up those communities? And it's the study of the structure and function of ecological communities. Right? This, if you think about how complex communities are, if you think about all the species that are there in a rainforest, you go to the Western Ghats and you walk into a rainforest, the number of species in the community there is immense. And the idea of trying to study all those interactions between all those species, potential or actual interactions between those species, is highly ambitious, right? To say that I'm going to actually study tens of thousands of species and how they're all interacting with each other is something that is near impossible. And so community ecology, what it does is that it breaks up the overall community into bite-sized pieces and says, we can't potentially study all this complexity, but what we can do is that we can take sets, subsets of those species in the community and study parts of that, right? Community ecology tends to become reduced to analytically tractable or easier to analyze modules. So you're taking out bits of the community to study. Community ecology is something that people talk about a lot, but in practice, what people are actually studying are what are called assemblages and not communities. So communities are all the set of potentially or actually interacting species, right? So you've got predators, you've got prey, you've got parasites, you've got disease agents, you've got vectors, you've got all of these various kinds of species, right? But in reality, what community ecology ends up being is actually studying assemblages. And what are assemblages? Assemblages are groups of species that are taxonomically defined. So you can have the bird assemblage, you can have the mammal assemblage or the invertebrate assemblage. And very often what you see in classical community ecology is that you're dealing actually with assemblages and their responses to some kind of gradient. So on the x-axis here is logging intensity. It's the amount of wood that's being taken out of a forest, right? So as you go towards the right, the more timber is being extracted from that forest. And what you're seeing on the y-axis here is relative species richness. So if the forest is undisturbed, species richness is 100%. As you go towards the right, what you're seeing with mammals is a drastic reduction in species richness, in the number of species of mammals that are there in the forest. What you're seeing with invertebrates is that the number of species that you see with logging does come down, but not as drastically as it does for mammals. With birds, actually, what you're seeing is there is actually a slight increase in the number of species despite disturbance. So that species might be interacting with this species might be interacting with that. It might be, this bird might be eating that insect, but that would make a community, right? It's all interacting species. But what commonly community ecology deals with is just how are bird numbers changing, how are mammal numbers changing, how are invertebrate numbers changing, how are amphibian numbers changing. So commonly community ecology ends up being assemblage ecology and not really community ecology. And that's something to keep in mind. Because very often we talk about bird communities or mammal communities, but communities are not taxonomically defined. Communities are defined by their interactions between species and interactions of species with the environment. So when I say bird community and I say I'm a community ecologist and I study birds, I'm an assemblage ecologist. I'm not really a community ecologist, right? So again, you'll see this very often, right? You'll see this with bird communities. You'll see this with things like how does the bird community respond to habitat fragmentation? And then within the bird community, we'll start dividing up species into what are called guilds. So different guilds have different properties. So you could say, of all these birds that are there in these fragments, you can ask, how does the survival rate of species change in large fragments versus small fragments. And then you can see that I have reason to believe that species that eat insects are likely to respond differently to fragmentation or deforestation than species that feed on nectar or species that feed on fruit. And for some reason, I believe this, or I have reason to expect this, because maybe with deforestation, what happens is that the insect community changes, but the fruiting trees don't change very much. So then I divide up species into guilds. So I can have species that are frugivores, feed on fruit, species that are nectarivores, species that feed on seeds, granivores, and then species that feed on insects. And then I can ask, actually, does the survival rate of terrestrial insectivores differ from the patterns in survival rates of terrestrial insectivores? Does it differ from patterns of survival rates of frugivores? And guilds are not necessarily only to do with diet. They could do with various things. So, for example, birds, you can have a guild that is cavity nesting, hole nesting birds, right? Versus birds that build nests that are open cup nests. So, any property of a species that might alter its responses to any kind of gradient. Let's say it's a temperature gradient or a rainfall gradient or a disturbance gradient, would be a guild. Right? So you can have various kinds of guilds. Those could be dietary, those could be body size, those could be behavioral also. So you're basically classifying species based on the properties that they show. So within a community or within an assemblage, you have guilds. So you have species that share certain properties, like in this instance, diet. Community ecology and community, just the science of community ecology has often been criticized as being a non-science. Lots of people have said communities are bound by space and time, right? So you've got a bunch of species in a certain place and at a certain time. Now, the properties that that set of species shows today might not be the same as the properties that another set of species in the same location will show tomorrow. And if I was to ask, how are desert communities structured? Why is it that there is a certain set of species that have a certain abundance in a desert community? Why is it that I have a certain set of species that have certain abundance in a rainforest community? The explanations for why you see those patterns in a desert versus a rainforest or a coral reef can be very different from each other, right? So if science is about uncovering or discovering general laws that can then explain patterns, community ecology, often you don't find those general laws. Because what's happening here can be very different from what's happening there. And what's happening here today can be very different from what's happening here tomorrow. So when you're talking about explaining communities, many people have said, that community ecology is a mess. It's that you've got so many different kinds of patterns, so many different kinds of laws that ultimately you don't end up having any one or few broad explanations for why things are happening the way they are. And so if you look at population ecology and you're just studying a population of a species, you can be pretty sure that the way that this population is going to behave will be very similar to the way another population is going to behave. In that early on, the population will grow slowly. Once the population becomes large enough, there are enough individuals, the population will start growing faster. And then once there are limited resources the population cannot exceed a certain size, then the population stops growing. And that's pretty much true for every population, right? So population ecology has laws. Um, Macroecology or biogeography has laws where you're saying things like the tropics always have more species than temperate areas. Um, Community ecology is where it gets hazy, where at that level between populations and between ecosystems, you're in that intermediate level studying communities, and um, there tend to be no immutable laws. There tend to be uh, no one or few explanations for why we're seeing the ways in which communities are structured. So Lawton in 1999 actually wrote a very critical piece about community ecology, saying that community ecology is a mess. Um, it's a non-science. Um, it's just too complicated to make sense of. But people have come back and said we actually can understand communities, and it's not only can we understand communities, it's worthwhile doing this. And this is Daniel Simbalov, who says that community ecology has been criticized because of the fact that there's so much complexity and so much contingency, so much idiosyncrasy, in that this community is going to behave differently from that community. But understanding this is important, especially in the context of things like conservation biology, especially in the context of things like emerging infectious disease. Because uh, if I want to understand what's going to happen to this community in response to an emerging threat, in emerging a disease, let's say, or deforestation, and these can both work together, right? You can have deforestation causing the emergence of infectious disease. Then I really need to understand what's happening there at that level. If I need to plan to make conservation initiatives to be able to address this emerging threat, then I need to understand what's happening at that level. So it's actually not just possible, but also important to understand how communities are responding to these emergent threats, and that's what Daniel Simbalov says. Um, that for both scientific and societal reasons, it is not time to abandon our understanding of what communities are. Other people have said that the way in which communities are understood, the way in which community ecology is understood, is in terms of asking how does this species interact with this species? Right? So let's say you've got two competitors, two plants that are competing for the same resources. Or you've got a predator and prey. So this is eating this. And a lot of community ecology has focused traditionally on the identities of those species. So you've got lynx and snowshoe hare, and that's predator and prey. And then you're asking, how does the population of the hare change? And in response to that, how does the population of the predator, which is the lynx, how does that change? And so a lot of people have focused on the identities of those species and saying, oh, Canada lynx feeding on snowshoe hare, this is how population dynamics will change over time. But instead of asking what those species are, does it make more sense to say, what are the functional traits of those species? So one is predator, one is prey. Can we generalize based on that? Instead of saying Canada lynx is eating snowshoe hare, can we say the predator population cycles track prey population cycles in a certain way? And because one is predator and the other is prey, can we then apply that logic to other sets of predators and prey? So Um, so McGill and so said, let's rebuild community ecology instead of saying this species is doing this to another species. So to ask what are the traits of this species? What are the properties of this species? What are the properties of this other species? And if you look at those ecological properties that those species have, then can the relationships between those species then be generalized to also relationships between other species that have the same traits? And sort of fundamental to this, fundamental to asking what are these properties that species share is the concept of the niche. How many people have heard the word niche? How many people have not heard the word niche? Everybody's heard of the word niche, right? What is a niche? Right. It's a place occupied by a species in a community. Right?
Where the particular species were lived in a particular region, where that in that particular region where the climate, the food will influence that particular species to evolve or to interact with each other.
Right. Yes, that's definitely one definition of the niche. Like most things in community ecology, the niche also has multiple definitions. And what if I say niche and you say niche, we can be talking about very different things. Um, and this is a problem with community ecology in general. Definitions of things are they mean different things to different people. But we'll talk about what the niche is. So if you're talking about rebuilding community ecology from the functional traits of an organism, if you're saying this species is a herbivore, that species is a predator, this species is a small uh, grain-eating species. Those are functional traits. Those are things about species that actually tell you something important ecologically about what those species are, right? And that then ties into what a niche is. In 1917, Grinnell was the first person who came up with a definition of the niche, and he did that using this bird species called the California thrasher. And Grinnell said that, I mean, this is his description of what a niche is. It's a distributional unit within which each species is held by its structural and functional limitations. Basically, he's saying this bird can't leave this habitat. So, I mean, that basically means that this species is adapted to this kind of habitat. And if this habitat ends and then you've got a new habitat next to it, then this species is not going to be able to move into the next habitat and occupy that habitat. So basically, structurally and functionally, this species is adapted to this habitat. So Grinnell comes up with the habitat niche concept, which is not the role that an organism is playing in the community, but pretty much where that organism is found. So when we say things like rainforest bird, coral reef fish, we're talking about the habitat niche concept. We're saying this species is limited to this kind of habitat. It cannot occupy any other kind of habitat. 10 years later, Elton comes up with the functional niche concept, which is the role that a species plays in its community, or status of an animal in its community is how he defines it. And he says, in a community, you can have, for example, a predator. That's the role that that organism plays in the community. It eats other things. Or you can have prey. Prey is eaten by other things. So that's the role that the species has in its in the community. Probably the most prevalent sort of definition of the niche is Hutchinson's. And Hutchinson in 1958 um, says it's an n-dimensional hypervolume, which which sounds like a lot, but it's basically saying for a particular organism, there are various environmental variables, and an organism can survive within certain limits of those environmental variables. So if you have a rainforest frog, yeah, the rainforest frog requires high humidity, high rainfall, warmer temperatures. So on the temperature axis, it's going to be on the higher end of the temperature axis. It's going to be in the higher end of the rainfall axis. So it requires high temperatures, high rainfall to persist. If you take it to a cold, dry place, it will die. So for a population to exist, it has to be within certain limits of its preferred environment. And that's what Hutchinson is talking about when it comes to what he calls an n-dimensional hypervolume. So we're talking about things like temperature and rainfall, right? But there could be so many other things that are influencing a species. Soil nitrogen, nutrient availability. Yes. Sorry.
When you say n environmental variables, does it always have to be abiotic? Like, the interacting species, like the other species which are interacting with.
Interactions between species as well.
Yeah, they're also considered.
That's also sort of implicit in that definition of the niche, where you've got environmental variables. So let's say you've got this rainforest frog, right? This rainforest frog is in this location and it's got no interactions with other frogs. And you've got the same species in another location where there are other frogs that are competing with it. The niche of that species here will be different from the niche of the species in the other location. So yes, so this does, it's basically what are the environmental conditions, including other species, within which a species can exist indefinitely. We should have a viable population, basically. Right? Population.
Hi. So, isn't like this Hutchinson definition is a superset of this Grinnell definition?
Sorry, can you speak a little louder?
Yeah. So this in environmental variable definition is a superset of this Grinnell definition, right?
Is it?
Superset. I mean, a habitat is like incorporated in the definition of.
Right.
Yeah.
So the habitat niche is a little bit, it does incorporate the environmental variables. For example, the California thrasher is found in chaparral. This kind of habitat is called chaparral. And it's basically dry, arid kind of habitat. So automatically, when you're talking about the habitat niche concept, you're also saying, oh, this habitat has low rainfall. It has high temperatures. But where Hutchinson's definition differs from the habitat niche concept is that it makes it slightly easier to start quantifying what that niche is. So instead of just saying, oh, chaparral habitat or rainforest bird or coral reef fish, you're actually starting to ask, okay, what are the properties of that habitat? Where you're saying this habitat has a certain degrees Celsius. This habitat has certain millimeters of precipitation. This habitat has this concentration of soil carbon. And so then you're starting to make more quantitative links between what the habitat, with the properties of the habitat and the existence of certain species.
Yeah. Thanks.
So the niche, then once you've got, you've got this property of a species, right? The species can or cannot exist in a certain location.
Like you are giving the example of coral reef fishes. So like as we know, like coral reefs are also declining. So what about if coral reefs are declining, so the particular habitat for the particular niche for this coral reef fish, so this will also decline as the niche will also, habitat will also change as the coral reefs are declining. So like it's a again interconnection between the coral reefs and the fish in the particular region. So
Yes. So you're saying that basically corals are also.
yeah, that is also declining. So I mean the coral fish will also go down. So the habitat, so it's again the interconnection.
Yes. So the habitat niche concept is very closely tied to what Hutchinson's niche concept. It's that, yes, in that the habitat niche concept of Grinnell is similar to Hutchinson's niche concept. But what Hutchinson is actually doing explicitly is saying or asking, what are the various properties of that habitat? Right? So if you're saying coral reef fish, and this fish is not found in open waters, right? It's not found in the sea. What are the properties of the coral reef and what are the properties of the fish that enable them to exist with each other? What are the properties of the fish that prevent it from occupying open ocean? So that's where that difference lies. But
it will come in n-dimensional hypervolume then. So this n-dimensional hypervolume, so this concept will come in that space then. So like you mentioned that the properties of that dish, right? So this n-dimension will cover that part.
right.
I feel.
Yeah. So
to add on to that, is this boundary like a binary thing or is it like a fuzzy thing?
you'll have to speak louder.
Yeah, is the boundary binary? What happens at the boundary binary, or is it fuzzy when it comes to things like survivability and all of that?
Binary or fuzzy?
Huh?
Binary or
Yeah. Is it like a 1 and a 0, or
zero kind of thing, or is it?
is it more
Oh,
like?
I see.
Is it?
We're getting to that. We're getting just a couple of more slides. Maybe things will become more clear. It's not really a binary thing. It's not really 1-0. There are limits on any axis so an organism can have an organism can be. I can't stay in areas that are colder than this. I can't stay in areas that are hotter than this. I need to be within this range limit, within this temperature limit. And then within that, it's not, so beyond those limits, it's definitely 1-0, right? It's 0 on this side, 0 on that side. The organism exists between those limits. But it will have small population sizes at the edges of its range. It will likely have larger population sizes in the middle part of that. But we'll see how that works. So this is what is called the fundamental niche. What you're talking about is called the fundamental niche, which is all the environmental conditions under which an organism can have a population growth rate that is equal to or greater than 1. So if your population growth rate is 1, the population is stable. If the population growth rate falls below 1, the population is declining. If the population growth rate is above 1, then the population is increasing. So to have a viable population, you need to have a population growth rate of at least 1. So either 1 or higher than 1. So it's the fundamental niche is all the conditions under which the pop.
What about Japan as a country of human population? The growth rate is, I mean.
Of human population?
Yeah, I mean, what if some country, it's not, population is not growing, it's declining, then how will this definition fit in?
So human populations are a bit of an aberration in that our populations don't behave in the way that natural populations behave, right? We're subsidized by various things. So, for example, there are very few species that are actually changing their own environment, right? So we are able to use tools and intelligence to build things like AC, right? And then be able to exist in places where ordinarily our physiological tolerances are not suited to. But that's not the case for most species. Most species are actually physiologically responding to their environment, and they're going to exist in places where physiologically they're able to exist. We are an aberration. We are a very unusual species. There are species that can regulate the environment. Termites, for example, build termite mounds, and the environment within a termite mound is very different from the environment that's outside the termite mound. But those are rare examples of what species are able to do. So our fundamental niche, if we are left without any of our, if just responding physiologically to what our bodies are able to tolerate, our fundamental niches would be much smaller than what it actually is. So the fundamental niche can be smaller than what's called the realized niche. So the classical definition, of the fundamental niche is all the environmental conditions under which a species can potentially exist and maintain a viable population. The realized niche is then saying, given that this species has a fundamental niche, if you start adding species interactions over this fundamental niche, what happens to actually where the species is found? So species can potentially be found in a certain range of conditions, but if you add a competitor, where is that species then actually found? And that becomes what's called the realized niche. And the competition has been the most sort of important interaction in community ecology and try to understand communities. So Joseph Cornell does this experiment in these intertidal pools. So you've basically got the ocean and you've got these shallow pools on the coast. And those pools get filled in during high tide, and then during low tide, when the ocean retreats, the pools become dry. And in these pools, Cornell finds two species of barnacles. Thamellus, that is found in the higher part of the pool, and Balanus, which is found in the lower part of the pool. So if you imagine a pool that's like that, then you've got Thamellus in the higher parts of the pool and Balanus in the lower part of the pool. And so what Cornell does is that he removes Thamellus, and in another experiment he removes Balanus, and in another experiment he removes Thamellus. So actually Thamellus is found here in reality, in nature. Right? But if you remove Balanus, then Thamellus is able to colonize the lower parts of the intertidal pool. So fundamentally, Thamellus can exist in this entire area, but realized because of the existence of a competitor, it is found only higher up. So the fundamental niche of Thamellus is the entire height of that intertidal pool, but it's found only in the upper part because there is a competitor. So the fundamental niche of Thamellus is larger than its realized niche, right? If you're measuring the niche along one axis, which is depth, then the fundamental niche of Thamellus is far larger than the realized niche of Thamellus. This can flip. You can have realized niches that are larger than the fundamental niches. And that sort of does not make sense a little bit, because if you're talking about something fundamental, then how can something realized be larger than the fundamental niche, right? But it does happen with interactions that are called facilitation, interactions that are mutualisms, where one species is actually benefiting another species. So if I need certain conditions and there's another species that creates those conditions, then I can actually benefit from the existence of that species. So the fundamental and the realized niches are very, very sort of crucial concepts in ecology, in community ecology. So actually, based on fundamental and realized niches, you can actually generalize in community ecology. So this idea that Lawton said that about communities, in that basically there's so much idiosyncrasy, there's so much difference between communities that you can't really generalize community, but turns out that you actually can. And this is again going back to McGill and colleagues, which is asking not about the identities of species, asking not does this eat this, does this compete with this, does this facilitate the other. It's asking what are the properties of those species. So they basically come up with this framework, which is ask how the fundamental niche is governed by the functional traits of a species along gradients. So you're saying, I am a 6-gram insect-eating bird. If that is my functional trait, those are my functional traits, how is it that I am likely to be influenced by the environment? So if I'm a small insect-eating bird, then I need large amounts of energy. I need to be able to maintain body temperatures, for example. And if that's the case, then there will be, on the temperature gradient, there will be places that I can exist and there will be places that I cannot exist. So what is the property, what are the properties of species that influence whether they're able to exist and maintain viable populations in a location or not? And then you've got then the interactions between, so that's the fundamental niche, right? If I am a 6-gram insectivorous bird, then there is a certain part of the temperature gradient where I can exist. There's a certain part of the temperature gradient where I cannot exist. And then you ask, how do I then start interacting with other species? Is there another 6-gram insectivorous bird in the habitat? If there is, then are we competing with each other? If we're competing with each other, then it's likely that the realized niche will then become smaller than the fundamental niche. Right? It's if there are two 6-gram insectivorous birds competing with each other, then they're likely not going to be found in the same location, because they simply cannot coexist. Right? So the realized niche then becomes smaller than the fundamental niche. Okay, there are other sort of extensions to community ecology that actually do have general rules where you can predict things. So for example, the tropics will always have more species than temperate areas. And this is true regardless of any continent. Wherever you go, tropics have more species than temperate areas. So this is a color-coded map of the number of bird species that are found in the Americas, and that's the equator. And it's around the equator that you see a large number of species. As you move away from the equator, the number of species reduces. So there are actually broad general laws in community ecology for, like the latitudinal species richness gradient, As in low latitudes, high number of species, high latitudes, low number of species. There's also what's called the species area curve, where the larger the area, the more number of species you'll have. So if you take area, if you start measuring area on the x-axis and the number of species on the y-axis, then as area increases, the number of species also increases until beyond a certain point, and this follows what's called a power law, a power equation. And beyond a certain point, there's no more new species to be added, and so this then reaches a plateau. So there are these general patterns that you see. Another general pattern that you see in ecology is what's called mass abundance scaling. So if you look at body mass on the x-axis and abundance on the y-axis, both of them are on the log scale. But smaller species tend to be more abundant. Larger species tend to be rarer or less abundant. They tend to have smaller population sizes. So if you go into a community of organisms, there will always be more mice than there are elephants. Mice will have much larger population sizes than elephants will. And any community will show this pattern broadly, where this is actually plankton. And even within plankton, smaller plankton will have high population sizes, larger plankton will have smaller population sizes. So this is a very a common pattern that you see in communities, where small species tend to be abundant, large species tend to be rare, or have smaller population sizes. Okay. So Varun and Divya will be talking about quantifying communities, but we have about half an hour, and let's just look at some of the interactions between species within a community. So what we're going to talk about now is sort of what is it that creates patterns in communities. So if you go out in a community and you say, you got 10 species, species 1 to species 10. And then each of those species has a certain abundance. It has a certain population size. And you can ask, why is it that species 2 is 10 times as abundant as species 6? Why does species 2 have a population size that is 10 times as high as species 6? And that's asking questions about community structure. When we talk about community structure, when we talk about the properties of a community, very often we're talking about the abundances of species in the community. And we're asking, what is the pattern? What is the distribution of the abundances of species in this community? And what are the various factors that cause species 2 to be far more abundant than species 6? What are these various processes that and these are often called niche-based models of community structure, and we'll talk about what that happens. And the theory of communities pretty much follows the theory of population genetics. So if you look at population genetics, you're asking, in a population, you have alleles, right? You have various versions of a gene, and the alleles can change. The frequency of different alleles can change, yes? And the frequency of those different alleles can change because of various things, right? So if an allele is actually harmful, then natural selection will cause that allele to reduce in frequency. So there's a selective process that can operate on allele frequencies. There's mutation. You can have new alleles coming up because of changes in just DNA, right? So if DNA mutates or RNA mutates, depending on what kind of organism you are, you can have new alleles forming, right? So the frequency of alleles is changing because of mutation. You can have frequencies of alleles changing randomly, which is called drift. And you can have the frequencies of alleles changing because of actual gene flow between populations. You can have new alleles coming in because a new individual joins the population. Same thing happens with species and the abundances of species. If you look at population genetics here, and you look at communities here, what you're talking about here is allele frequencies. What you're talking about here is just species abundances. And the same thing can happen with species abundances, right? You can have selective processes, which is basically saying, if I'm a species not adapted to this environment, then my abundance in this environment will be low. If I'm a species highly tolerant to this environment, highly adapted to this environment, then my abundance in this environment will be high. So that's what is changing abundances of species in the environment. So selection can operate over there. You can have speciation where you have new species forming, and that's sort of similar to mutation, right? Mutation is causing the emergence of new alleles. Speciation causes the emergence of new species. Yeah. You can have random changes, which is again called drift. So there's no deterministic reason why a species is increasing or decreasing in population size. It might be random. And very often when we say random, it's putting in all the things that we can't understand about that system into that box that's called random, right? It's probably not random at all, but there are things about that system that we don't understand. We don't understand why the species is changing in population size. We just put that into a convenient box called drift. And then you can have species moving from location to location. And so you've got changes in the abundance of species arising from dispersal. So let's look at some of the ways in which these communities are structured, right? Think about
a small thing, Umesh. So I was trying to understand the drift part, how we can relate that to the communities. So could you please, like, give us an example how we can think this is a stochastic process, or I understand with the unknown things we've been into the things we don't like random, but can we have an example or something to kind of visualize this process can be something similar to drift, something?
Yeah, so for example, there's something called demographic stochasticity, right? And that is variation in birth rates and death rates. Right? So if you have a population, the population will have a certain birth rate, it will have a certain death rate, right? So if the birth rate and death rates are equal, then the population remains stable. Demographic stochasticity is this box where we say there is random variation in birth rate and death rate. And the random variation in birth, so today I lay 3 eggs, right? And another individual in the same population is laying 2. Another is laying 6. So there's variation there that we don't know why this individual is laying 6 eggs and why this individual is laying 2 eggs. There's probably a reason, right? But we don't understand why that's happening. And so we say, this is random variation in birth rates, right? And then ultimately that goes into a box called demographic stochasticity. There's a reason, but we don't know what that reason is.
I can relate this to the influenza virus, where drift is happening. Because of that, we have to take the seasonal influenza vaccine. So it is a mutation accumulating at HA protein. So it is happening with the virus all the time. Because of that, it is changing continuously. And because of that change, that antigenic properties are changing. So yeah.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, there could be some explanation for why things are changing the way they are.
Because of replication, polymerase is like adding that
Right.
change.
But very often what happens is we don't understand the reasons for that change. We don't understand the reasons for that variation. And then what we just do is we say, okay, it's all drift, it's all stochasticity, it's all
Yeah, so the example you gave of demographic stochasticity, I mean, it is statistically quantified as differences in, say, birth rate, right?
right.
But there might be reasons like individual quality, how gene environment interactions, what your genetic makeup is, and how you make the best of the environment given your genetic makeup. So it's not that it's random in the sense that we model it as random, but it's not without any cause.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, so it's our thinking and our conceptual approach towards that is putting them in putting this variation in different bins, explained variation and unexplained variation. And often the unexplained variation becomes drift.
Yeah, so just emphasizing this point because yesterday Ashwin, he talked about models, GLM and stuff, and he talked about random effects and fixed effects.
Right.
And what is something we don't know anything about versus something which we know it impacts something else, but we don't know how. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, parallel, this is something called environmental stochasticity. So you've got a process where it's an unpredicted by us, right? So one day you have a snowstorm, and that wipes out half the population of a species, right? So that's an environmental. It's not a predictable thing that happens every year. It's not something that's repeated. It's not like seasons where you've got a wet season and a dry season, or a warm season and a cold season. That's predictable. You can ask, how does change in season actually affect a population or a community? But with things like extreme events or things unpredictable events like a storm or a cyclone or something that's not seasonal, something that's not predictable, that can also change population sizes, that can change communities. And that's what's called environmental stochasticity. And that's another form of randomness that influences populations. But let's talk about stuff that's predictable. Stuff that we can actually say influences the structure of communities. You think of India, huge country. Great Indian bustard is only found in the desert and in arid areas. Right? Dark-fronted babbler is only found in the rainforest. And so you've got, at the level of India, you've got a regional species pool. You've got a set of species that are found across, if you just totaled in India, you've got 1,300 bird species. Not all of them are found everywhere, right? So if you go to Ooty and you count the number of bird species, it's not going to be 1,300. Or you go to Arunachal Pradesh and you count the number of bird species, not going to be 1,300. It's going to be a subset of that. Not all species are found everywhere. Right? And so when you've got a regional species pool, whether a species can be found in a location or not depends on its fundamental niche. Whether it can be found or not. Right? Whether it's actually found or not, we'll see what happens to that. But you've got a bunch of species, and then you've got a habitat. And that habitat has certain properties. It's got temperature, rainfall, whatever. Yeah. So let's say this is desert habitat. Now, you've got different species that have different traits, right? And large-sized, larger species are perhaps unable to tolerate this habitat because some trait that they have. So let's say large size is cold adaptation. So the larger you are, the more adapted you are towards the cold. Now this is a desert. It's hot. So the desert will filter out the larger species. So you end up with species that tend to be smaller. Smaller, not actually in terms of body size, just representing that trait, which is warm adaptation. So you end up with, from the regional species pool, the habitat imposes a filter that ultimately ends up with a local species pool or a habitat species pool. Now, these species are all similar to each other in terms of cold adaptation, but they're different from each other in other ways. Some might be large, some might be small, some might be old. And so you end up, if you have species at a local scale, at the community level, and you're going out to the community and you're asking, what are the species that actually live with each other? Potentially, all of these could live with each other. They've been filtered out through the habitat, right? So they're all there in the habitat. But if you go to the local scale and you look at a community, you'll see that if these species are competing with each other, they've been filtered out based on warm adaptation. So they're all similarly sized, but there are other traits that are different. So let's say, similar size in terms of the circle itself, right? So they're all warm adapted species, but there are other ways in which they might be different from each other. So this might be a seed eating species, that might be an insect eating species. So this will compete with this. This will compete with this, right? And so when you end up with communities actually on the ground, you've got species that coexist with each other because they're avoiding competition, right? So basically what you've got is a habitat species, a large regional species pool, then gets filtered by a habitat to form a habitat species pool. So the habitat species pool is all potential species that can actually live there based on the fundamental niche. But whether they actually live with each other or not depends on species interactions, biotic interactions. So you've got an abiotic filter here. The abiotic filter selects for species that have a certain fundamental niche. And then biotic interactions after that then determine whether species actually coexist with each other or not, and that's the realized niche. This is one model of community structuring, and it's the most prevalent way in which we understand how communities are structured. Let's just look. Okay, so we're talking about the habitat filter, and then we're talking about interactions between species, and interactions between species can be very, very varied. So the way people think about interactions is, if you look at two species, species A, species B, what is the effect that species A has on species B? What is the effect that species B has on species A? And this is typically thought of in terms of population growth rates. So if species B is found in a certain location and it has a certain population growth rate, right? And then you add species A. What is the effect that A has on B? So if you add species A, does it increase the population growth rate of B? Does it decrease the population growth rate of B? And then vice versa, right? So B is also having some effect on A. So what is the effect that B has on A? So if B has a positive effect on A, then the presence of B is going to cause the population of A to rise. If B has a negative effect on A, then the B is going to cause the population growth rate of A to fall. And then you can ask, what are these joint effects between A and B? So if species A has a negative effect on B and B has a negative effect on A, that's what is competition. Yeah? Competition is sort of like the fundamental interaction in community ecology. A lot of stuff in community ecology is based on competition theory. It's only off late that other interactions between species have become um, uh, um, something that people are studying more and more consciously. Competition is sort of like classical community ecology. Classical community ecology deals with competition, where if you take species A and you put it with species B, species A is going to, an increase in the abundance of species A is going to cause a decline in the abundance of species B. An increase in the abundance of species B is going to cause a decline in the abundance of species A. So that's competition between species. And then you can have various combinations of that, right? So if you've got this, which is particularly important in the context of disease, where you've got species A has a negative impact, species B has a negative impact on species A, but species A has a positive impact on species B, which is basically, if I eat you, you're losing, I'm gaining. So predation is one example of how one species has a positive impact on the other, but it suffers in the bargain. It loses out. Parasitism, means predators actually eat you from the outside. Parasites, disease eat you from the inside. And so parasitism, disease is another example of how you have this asymmetry of interactions between species where one has a positive effect on the other has a negative impact. So if you get malaria, it's great for the malarial parasite, not so good for you, right? And then you have interactions where you have mutually positive interactions between species, which are called mutualisms or symbiosis, where species A has a positive impact on B and B also has a positive impact on A.
Does this applicable for the viruses also? Like, can we apply this to viruses? Like, I will give example of dengue viruses. Equilibrium.
Viruses.
Suppose dengue is having 4 serotype, so all 4 are not prevalent in one place, like, or so one serotype will come, other will go, or it will reduce. So suppose we are introducing some vaccine for dengue, and because of that, dengue prevalence will go. So whether it will replace with some other virus which is similar.
So that's a competitive interaction, right? So
how we can study such in lab or something? Can we study this in lab?
I mean, people do study this regularly in the lab. I'm not sure about viruses, but we see some other examples of how people have studied things like competition, mutualisms, not just in the lab, but also using experiments in the field. Viruses, I'm not very certain about.
So,
Farah, want to add something?
no. So as of for Krishna said, can I say that the species A and species B is nothing but the variant? It is nothing but an evolved species of A that it has adapted to this system, I think say. Because what it makes means the species evolution, if you go through, it is evolved from a single organism or single things. So I can say that.
Yeah, so he's basically saying that they're all very closely related. So I think that is a problem with microbes in general. Defining species,
right.
Like, for example, from a clinical perspective, you talk about serotypes or strains, like we're talking about TB or whatever. But are they species? We really don't know, right? So that's one of the problems with thinking of communities of microbes. And most of our ways to assay them are sequencing, which is nothing to do with biology in some sense, right? We just sequence 16S or something and we say all of these OTUs, operational taxonomic units, are present. But that is not necessarily a community. So that is something which probably, we struggle with.
So classic community ecology definitions of species and so on will fail completely when it comes to things like RNA viruses, right? When you're talking about things like SARS, and you're talking about strains of things like COVID. Are those species? Are those not species? Quantify.
So basically, the way we define species in say mammals or birds and all is not going to work at all. So I don't know how, and we are not actually assessing interactions. So the way Umesh has been talking a lot today is about interactions. In communities, we're talking about, interactions, positive, negative. That is what defines the community. And
that's what ultimately ends up in community structure. That's what ultimately ends up in changing the relative abundances of species in the community. So if you have a host community, primates as a host community, and primates are susceptible to, let's say, some kind of immunodeficiency, kind of HIV or SIV, then basically what we're talking about here is what is changing the relative abundance of, let's say, orangutan versus chimpanzee versus rhesus macaque versus human beings. And these interactions, then basically, you have, if you have Spanish flu that hits you in 1918, 1919, and reduces the population size of Europe by a third. So that's an example of interaction between species where the flu, the influenza virus, is benefiting and humans are losing. And so that's an example of something like this, changing the relative abundances of influenza versus human beings.
So just responding to the dengue virus, what you were asking about the serotype 1 versus 2, 3, and 4. So the way I am looking at it, what Umesh you are describing, you talked about growth rate, right? One species over the other. So which means those species are expected to be directly in contact, like in the same habitat. So there's a kind of competition and all kinds of these processes are happening. So for something like influenza, this will work very well, right? It requires lots of connectivity between the individuals, and it relies on the density of certain individuals, and you have some super spreader, and then, infection is going on. But with respect to a vector-borne disease, like what we are talking, it's not dependent on direct transmission. It's more of a frequency, right? Doesn't really rely on it's just kind of a very random thing. You have something which is infected, and so the pattern here, what you expect would be very different. I don't think we can equate it to that. And it also depends what kind of different serotypes you have in an existing population, and then you have a mosquito involved, like all kinds of things comes into play. So I don't think that would really fit in this scenario because it's not really density dependent as such. And that's how I would look at it.
While you were telling this interaction, previously you said that the complexities, which are one of the naturalists has mentioned, the ecology or the ecosystem is much more complex. So what I thought is this complexity or this, what it makes the species to evolve, because the balance, because in this ecosystem there is so much of randomness, these interactions and this positiveness, negativeness. This is what makes the community stable, I think. So this complexity makes the community stable, I think.
I don't know. No, go ahead.
Yeah, the more complex the community becomes, the more species you have, the more things become difficult to understand. There are all sorts of feedback mechanisms. For example, biodiversity itself, if you add species, that makes it possible to actually have more species. Things like that start kicking in. What we're talking about here is sort of like classical community ecology, where you're only looking at pairs of species. And we've sort of moved beyond that in terms of understanding complexity with things like network theory, where you're looking at multiple species embedded within interaction networks with each other. But we're not going to get into that today. But yes, you're absolutely right in that the number of things that we do not then start understanding about things that are very, very complex, then ends up, like I was saying, community ecology itself is a highly ambitious undertaking. to try and understand all the potential interactions between species in a community, especially complex communities, things like rainforests and coral reefs, is very, very difficult. Almost, I would say, perhaps impossible.
So in terms of the microbial ecology, so these type of interactions do happen in microbes, but I think the recent trend is that they have taken out species altogether. They have considered only guilds, cheaters, or secondary, if only which use glucose, only which use certain biochemicals. They have broken down all the species into guilds and functional traits, and entire species only is eliminated from the entire model is what trend is.
Yeah, so that's great that you brought up that point, and I think that maybe I'm speaking too much as usual, but while it seems like it's so complicated, we can never figure it out, and at first glance, ecology always seems like that, but there are a lot of generalities which are not very specific generalities. Like, you can't predict the exact abundance of a specific species in a specific location. But there are grand generalities, like you talked about, that small things are more abundant than large things. Tropical communities are more diverse than temperate. And the question is, are those enough? Those types of generalities when talking about systems in disease ecology, where there are communities of hosts, there are communities of vectors, there are communities of pathogens, and they're all dynamically changing. So is disease ecology then impossible, according to you?
Just think of HIV-1, right? HIV-1 has jumped once from a chimpanzee to a human being. And then HIV-1 has then become a pandemic. How do you predict something like this? How do you predict spillovers? How do you predict something like SARS or COVID? Where are the points of origin? COVID, till today, we don't know what the host of something like Ebola is. We don't know what the host of something like COVID is. We have some idea, maybe pangolins, maybe bats, maybe some wet market in Wuhan, where something jumped from something to a civet and then to human beings. But emerging infectious diseases, especially, what the points of spillover are, you can have something random like HIV or something random like COVID, but you can also have something highly predictable like Lyme disease, where you've got communities of rodents and shrews that actually have the Lyme disease pathogen, and then you've got ticks transmitting Lyme disease to human beings, and that is highly predictable. The years when the oaks actually bear fruit and have acorns, those are the years in which the rodent populations boom. Those are the years in which Lyme disease transmissibility to human beings becomes much higher. So we understand a lot about certain emerging infectious diseases, perhaps far less about others, especially in terms of the emergence of those diseases. Once HIV is in human beings, we know how it spreads, right? But what is it that causes simian immunodeficiency virus to then become human immunodeficiency virus is something that is probably far less predictable than what this framework is actually.
So basically what you're saying is that because that's a specific event, it's a detail. I mean, not trivializing it at all. And details might be harder, but broad relationships might be easier.
Yeah.
So basically the question is, does it even make sense to understand communities of hosts and this and that when all of this is so complicated?
When it comes to things like immunodeficiency viruses, and you've got actually communities that are susceptible, You've got primate communities that are susceptible. Those could be, if you look at your African primate community, you've got, first of all, it's immensely species rich, right? You've got so many species of primates that are potentially susceptible to immunodeficiency viruses. And the virus can actually jump across species. So you can have the same virus infecting a mangabe, you can have the same virus infecting a chimpanzee. And so you've got actually cycling of that virus happening within the host community of primates in an African forest. So those things are probably more predictable. When you actually say, predict what are the rates of transfer between species in the host community. But when it comes to emerging infectious diseases, we're primarily sort of talking about ourselves, right? We're talking about...
No, that's fine. So basically, you are saying that understanding host communities, primary hosts or reservoirs, can allow for some predictability of transmission dynamics, at least in them. So that's, yeah.
Sorry, Adi, I'll let you know. So when Umesh, you started talking about all the, power law and all the generalities, most of them have been explored in parasites as well, and they do fit, that island species area curve, how the parasite richness is so high, in equator, but then versus in the cold region. All of those actually applies very equally, and it allows you to understand. And one of the classic example, actually, what he was explaining about how say, abiotic factors, they filter things out, right? Species. It's for parasites as well. I think tomorrow Ashwin will talk about some of that stuff. I mean, how Plasmodium is not found in the high elevation environment. It's only in the thing. And there's a different community of parasites you see, which is restricted to some of the bird species which are found versus in the lower elevation. So it's those kind of questions related to how the communities are structured in the host, but as well as in the parasite. I think that helps us to understand how the disease ecology actually works. That example of HIV is very good, and that applies very well with the dengue and Zika as well. But yeah, so that's good.
Thanks. Sorry, I put you on the spot, Umesh.
We're out of
time. You're not yet done, right? Or you're finished?
yeah,
oh, you're done. Okay, sure.
I
Then
had
other
one
questions.
I had one question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I had a doubt about fundamental niche. So fundamental niche, we define it for a species A, independent of other species, right? At the baseline, we can't consider other species, right? Like whether the interaction is happening between species A and B, that is not considered, right? It's on its own in the environment, right? When we define. So for a virus, fundamental niche is 0, right?
Yeah, so this is highly simplistic.
No, my point was, if fundamental niche for a virus can be defined as 0, why don't we just apply all these laws for for species with non-zero fundamental niche?
Species with what, sorry?
Species with non-zero fundamental niche. And then we can get away with the exception of the virus, right?
So every species is going to have a fundamental niche, right? So for any species, the fundamental niche is non-zero.
For virus, it's 0, right? Because it's not life outside, it's the host. And if you consider species A and B, if you try to bring it in this framework, the fundamental niche, we define it before the interactions between A and B even happen. So at that level, you said first we considered the environment, and next level we move to the interactions, right? There is that sequential thing in this framework. So in this framework, virus cannot have a fundamental niche, right? Like it's 0. Yeah. So in this framework, virus cannot have a fundamental niche. It's 0. So because it's not a life outside the interaction between A and B. right?
No, so the fundamental niche is classically defined as the interaction between the species and its environment. And the fundamental niche is dependent on what the properties that the properties that the species has. So, if I have a physiological tolerance for temperatures between 22 and 26 degrees Celsius, then that's my fundamental niche on the temperature axis. Right, and then I will have a fundamental niche, I will have another axis of rainfall or whatever, right? And then put together all those abiotic variables will then influence what my fundamental niche is. The realized niche, classically in community ecology, the realized niche arises from once you've crossed the habitat filter and you've made it into the habitat, where you are found in that habitat. So for example, rainforest is a huge habitat, right? You have rainforest in Northeast India, you have rainforest in the Western Ghats. But species will not be, just because a species has a fundamental niche that is rainforest, let's say, the properties of a rainforest, does not mean that it will be found in the Western Ghats and in Northeast India. There will be other interactions between species that will determine whether the species is found here or not.
No matter what the other axes are, the reproductive rate of a virus is 0 outside its host, right?
Different perspective. So you need to consider the niche inside the host, not outside the host. So all these model apply when the virus enters inside the host. I mean, there is one more way to look at it. I mean,
Something more in depth and philosophical, probably. And one more question from Deva and.
Okay, so my question is just so a particular pathogen, when it's in a host and primary host basically, do they have that many variants? Because when it jumps to human communities, given that our communities are so complex with folks from around the world living in the same space, is that why we are getting so many variants? Because it's trying to adapt to each individual, wherein in primary host community it was just one population that might have that pathogen. So when it jumps, because of our complex communities, is it like converting into so many variants together?
In the community, who is the most susceptible to that particular pathogens, basically? So for me, I think a classic textbook example always has been not the virus thing, but for the Hawaiian birds, for example, they evolved without those blood-borne pathogens. And when you accidentally introduce both mosquito and the parasite, it kept infecting the resident birds, or the native birds, which didn't have the immunity. Even today, they die of those infections as opposed to the introduced ones. So
Next, 11.
One last question. Done? Okay. Okay, please go ahead.
Most fundamental question. So you have explained the niche of different environmental conditions. Today, after realizing the effect of global warming, now we would like to shift, we would like to increase the forest area, reforestation. Say now the people are thinking in a different countries like converting desert into forest. So as an ecologist, by thinking biodiversity, Do you accept that opinion?
I think this is more of a moral question than I'll talk a little bit later about some of the research that we're doing on climate change and forest loss. I think it ends up coming down to trade-offs. Right? You're saying things like climate change is occurring primarily because of increased CO2 concentrations. So if you want to reduce CO2 concentrations, it does make sense to actually convert habitats from non-forest into forest. Right? The trees are soaking up soaking up carbon. What that means for biodiversity in a non-forest.
Population present exclusively in the desert, they will vanish if you.
Right. So I think it's about priorities, and it's about asking, are we willing to sacrifice, Great Indian bustard, for example, to reduce carbon dioxide concentrations. Yeah, it's a priority question. I might value Great Indian bustard far more than I might value what's happening with climate change. You might say that's not a valid approach at all. What we really need to do doesn't matter if the bustard goes extinct. We need to reduce CO2 concentrations. I think it's more of how we value things as a society rather than. There are no easy answers with climate change, right? It's how do you actually get rid of CO2? You could say something like, let's seed the atmosphere with sulfur dioxide so that solar radiation is reflected back into space. But then that could cause crop failures. That could cause various other. So yeah, it's about how we approach things as a. But with climate change, one of the things that's happening, especially in the context of emerging infectious diseases, is that vectors are shifting their ranges. So with climate change, what's happening is a lot of species are shifting their ranges. So you've got mosquitoes now in Scandinavia, which would never, historically human beings have not, in Norway or Sweden, have not had to deal with mosquitoes. Now you've got mosquitoes coming into Britain and you've got mosquitoes coming into Scandinavia, bringing disease into susceptible populations. And that's happening with host communities of, let's say, birds. So you got, where I work in Arunachal Pradesh, there were no mosquitoes 15 years back at 2,000 meters above sea level. Today you have to use Odomos. Because the mosquitoes have moved up, it's warmer, they're able to move up. And so now we're seeing an increased prevalence of things like avian pox, bird pox, because these mosquitoes have now come. Species and populations that had never had to deal with something like avian pox, now there's pox in these populations. So climate change is definitely causing major shifts in the ways in which hosts, vectors, and pathogens are interacting with each other because of range shifts. Thank you.
Yeah. Also, Umesh is here throughout the day. You can discuss these points with him and catch hold of him and talk more. Yeah.